So one of the things Heaven Hill's really obviously known for is being able to handle quite old bourbon, older than almost anybody else in the market. So what's the secret to that?
Well, the first secret to that is just the stocks, having the stocks. So, when you've got 1 million barrels, you've got kind of an embarrassment of riches there, in that you've probably got a barrel or a number of barrels in pretty much any aging condition that you want them to be in at any given point. So, but the other thing is that we've got 49 warehouses that are scattered throughout, mostly in here in Nelson County. We've got a few at the distillery in Jefferson County. But the warehouses are all themselves a little bit different from each other in terms of how they're located, airflow, how the sun hits them, etc. But also within any given warehouse, each of the floors gives a much different aging story to the barrels. And I think this is something that's almost a little bit underappreciated by people. I always say that, sure, the age of the whiskey or the age of the barrel is important, but where it's spent those years is about as important as how many years it's spent. Because here we're on the first floor, when you put a barrel here at our barrel entry proof of 125, at 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years, it will actually lose proof down here on the first floor. So after a number of years, it might be 122, might be 121. However, that situation changes greatly as you go up in the warehouse, because the temperature gradients are much greater up at the top. The airflow makes that chimney effect. So at the top, you're going to be talking about the same barrel that would lose proof down here, gaining dramatic amounts of proof up there. So, for instance, I was talking about how we had done a seminar before where we had pulled 2 30-year-old barrels, one from the first floor, which still had some outage on it, but still was basically over 47 gallons left in a 53-gallon barrel after 30 years, mind you, and one from the top floor, where we literally dumped it and we had 3 750 ml bottles left out of 53 gallons. What was left was at 170 proof. And what happens there is, because of the beauty of the American white oak, the pores are such that water can escape. Water is obviously a simple molecule, H2O. It can escape easily through the pores of the wood, but alcohol, which is obviously a much larger, more complex organic chain molecule, cannot. So water leaves, alcohol stays in, proof goes up, taste goes exponentially up. And so that basically is kind of the dynamics of aging and location within the warehouse.
So when you're going to do a special release like a Parker's, do you have a particular warehouse, a particular level that you have in mind, or how does that work?
Generally, yeah. With a release like Parker's, where we're dumping generally between 60 and 100 barrels for the whole release, we'll generally try and get those all from the same area. Or, I guess it depends a little bit on the product. For like the Parker's release this year, where we're combining barrels of aged wheated bourbon with rye-based bourbon, the rye bourbon probably all came from the same area and the wheated bourbon came from the same area, but those 2 groups of barrels did not necessarily come from the same area. So to your point, I mean, it becomes a bit of a blending exercise as much as anything else. The word blending is almost a kind of a taboo word in the American whiskey business, because everybody thinks of American blended whiskey. But the idea of blending barrels together, and the Golden Anniversary, I think, was a good example of how, if you do that skillfully, it really yields great results.
So, how old is the most viable barrel of whiskey right now in your 40-something warehouses?
Well, I mean, again, to the earlier point about that, I bet we've got some close to 30-year-old barrels here. If they're in low storage, I bet they're absolutely wonderful. If they're in high storage, they're probably going to be blended off into some blended whiskey that we've got.
So I mean, especially for the whiskey enthusiast who's now spending hundreds of dollars on a release, I mean, how do you navigate the differences between maybe a 20-year-old bourbon that's been aged now here on the first floor, and maybe a 20-year-old bourbon somewhere else that's been aged in different circumstances?
Well, I guess in all honesty, the first challenge in navigating that is actually getting that information, because it's when we bottle a single barrel, we'll tell you when it was barreled, but we won't necessarily tell you the location of that barrel. So that's one of those things that you almost may have to come to a distillery to learn about, or experience maybe those taste gradations that might happen from top to bottom, or attend a seminar or a whiskey show where somebody's going to specifically point that out to you. It becomes challenging for a consumer because they don't necessarily know that this bottle of single barrel from barrel number X aged on the 4th floor, whereas this one aged on the 7th floor. You may be able to discern that there's difference. You may be able to notice that the whiskey from the top floor is darker. That's usually one of your easiest kind of tells. But that's part of the thing about the mystique about single barrels, I guess, is that, the more you taste, the more nuances and differences you will detect between. I mean, these two barrels literally will taste different. They're right next to each other. They can spend 10 years. And this also goes to what we were talking about earlier, that nobody quite understands what happens here in the warehouse. There's some kind of magical thing that takes place in these barrels, such that these two barrels, which could be the same barrels produced from the same tree, literally in this cooperage in the same run, and they're right here filled to the same whiskey, so aging literally 4 inches from each other, and you dump these things and they could taste very different. It's just it's the beauty of kind of how the natural aging takes place.
Is there something about your mash bill that lends itself to longer age?
I guess through experience, our mash bills, and it's a very traditional. It's the mash bill that Parker's father Earl brought with him over from Jim Beam. It's been tweaked a little bit over the years, but basically it's very similar to the Beam mash bill. And it's the Beam family yeast as well. I guess the short answer to that is I suppose so, because we've got highly acclaimed 27, 21, 23-year-old whiskeys that do seem to age pretty well. I guess it seems to me that Parker and Craig are 6th and 7th generation master distillers. It's all these guys have known. They've eaten, breathed. That's all they've done their whole lives. I think when they do it as well as they do it, it is a very flexible type of mash bill. It works very, very well, even for our 4-year-old whiskeys that we dump. I mean, they're pretty good 4-year-old whiskeys.
How far out do you know what Parker's will be? How many?
What the next release of Parker's?
Yeah, I mean, how far do you have to plan?
Usually we're about 2 years out on those types of things. That being said, however, if we decide that we want to do something that requires an aging regimen, like, for instance, in this warehouse right now up in the upper floors, we've got a bunch of, tongue and groove staves, we've got corrugated staves, we've got heavy char, we've got a lot of different types of experimental aging things that are taking place, and that of course you've got to decide to do now with new whiskey, and then just see how it turns out and taste it over a number of years, and that's part of the whole process. So there's kind of those types of releases where you're literally starting from square one and doing something with the aging regimen or the mash bill even during the production end of it, and then there's those like the one we did this year where we basically just taken select barrels of weeded bourbon, select barrels of rye-based bourbon, and blended those together.
Now, Rittenhouse was one of the early ryes that on the kind of tip of this rye, wave. How has it been riding that wave, and now how do you deal with, a thirst for rye that is, almost immeasurable?
Well, I guess the short answer to that is you make more of it. You make as much of it as you can. I mean, before, 6-7 years ago, we were making ourselves bean, turkey. Basically, the three of us were the only ones that were mashing rye regularly. We made it 2 days a year. We made it 1 day in the fall, 1 day in the spring, and that was all. We literally would just start the still and make rye in 1 day. And incidentally, the bourbon that you make the day after you make rye is awesome. Using rye backset to make bourbon it's a really cool product. But that's a story for another time. But the rye has just been, we've made rye for a long time. We made it twice a year. It was plenty for many, many years. Literally in the space of about a year, we saw demand pick up to the point where we started to make it 3 times a year. Now we're making it once a month.
Huh.
So we're making it as quick as we can. Of course, the challenge there is that We do natural open rick aging, so the Rittenhouse bond is a 4-year-old, so it's got to get age on it before we can bottle it. So, but we've been in this now 4, 5, 6 years, so we're now starting to kind of see our stocks get a little bit more in line. So, assuming that the rye trend will continue and it shows no signs of not continuing, we will have plenty to supply here in the next year or two.
Are there other lines of inquiry that you're looking at that you think will come to fruition 5, 10, 15 years down the line?
Other
mash bills, products.
Yes. I mean, like I say, we've got, and you got to do this. I mean, we've got lots of different things in the hopper right now, from things that tweak our standard mash bill to things that are almost completely dedicated to one particular type of grain. We're doing things with some non-traditional grains. We're all doing things like that because you've got to be. You're at the point right now, as I mentioned earlier in our conversation, where people are saying, I love this stuff. What else is there? What else can you show me? What else can I taste? And we are painted into such a kind of corner by the government regulations in terms of what can be called straight whiskey and then what can be called straight rye whiskey and straight bourbon whiskey, that there's just not that much you can do at face value. That being said, all the things that you can do, we're doing. We're messing around with different types of grains and different proportions of grains within our mash bills. We certainly are looking at different things in the aging regimen, whether it's things to the barrel, things to the char, things to the stades. So all those things are pretty much fair game right now. I guess both the beauty and the curse of this is we don't know how they're going to turn out. And we'll see how they turn out. They may be great, and we may have a great discovery on our hands and the next great new thing. They may be awful, and we may have to blend them away in one of our big blended whiskeys somewhere where we can hide mistakes. We'll see.